Welcome back to the channel. My name's Mike and I'm an indie developer working on my first game, TurtleRun. It's that exciting time again where I get to start working on a fresh new zone. I've decided to make the new zone the Street Zone, inspired quite heavily by Kerning City from MapleStory, which I think aesthetically and musically is one of the coolest zones I've ever played. I really wanted to streamline my workflow using what I've learned from the previous zones before jumping right in, so I decided to have a bit more of a planning phase this time. I got to work creating a list of notes for the planning, design, implementation and testing phases of the zone. I wanted to start with the base level design and the tile set. These do tend to evolve as I introduce new enemies and program their mechanics, but they're a very good thing to get down early for grasping the vibe of the zone. My level design process is lackluster to say the least, usually consisting of me sketching things out on OneNote and seeing how it goes from there. What the f— I had a brief look around to see if I could find any proper tools for this job, but I couldn't really find much, and I do like the process the way it is, so this will do for now. I wanted to try and make the levels in this zone feel slightly longer than the last ones, as they do feel a little bit brief. I started trying to plan things out and look around for inspiration and ideas, but that didn't really pan out, so I just reverted back to my normal process of starting drawing and seeing what happens. I just draw whatever comes to my head generally, and tweak it later when I have a better grasp of what will actually work. I didn't really manage to preserve any kind of scale here. I'm definitely no artist. This seems complex and fun enough to be a good introduction to the street zone. Now I wanted to create my environment tile set. I generally don't start creating the art until the foundations of whatever I'm creating are already down, but I was itching to get a feel for how this zone was going to look. It wasn't as simple as the previous two levels, as the nature of it being a wall kind of calls for a bit more variation, and any repeating things like cracks were pretty obviously repeating and a bit ugly. I'll go with this for now and see how it looks in game. I threw together all of the different variations that I'll need and parked that for now. I'll definitely have to improve this as it's not quite up to par. Maybe an option is to use something other than a brick layout and more in line with previous zones. That would make more sense. Now I get to do one of my favourite things, actually creating the level. I quickly encountered my first issue, which related back to a previous update I made to moving platforms. They used to just move automatically, but then that would sometimes force the player to have to wait for the platform to come back to them before they could progress. I thought it was a much better player experience if the platform was always waiting for the player and started moving once they had actually landed on it. Since I had areas with multiple platforms moving simultaneously, I had a script to start movement on all the moving platforms when one was touched. This worked great up until now, when I have multiple platforms moving in different areas of the same level. Obviously, we don't want jumping on a platform in one area of the level to cause movement on the platforms later in the level. Thankfully, there was quite an easy fix for this, which was to create a property on the moving platform object which holds a group number for the platforms, and update the script to only initialize movement on the instances of platforms within that group. So, after overcoming this issue, I got back to adding the level object and gave it a couple of run-throughs and thought it felt really good. I started getting some of the basic tiling down just to make things feel a little nicer while developing and testing enemies. I definitely wasn't completely happy with this tile set, but I didn't want to get hung up on it right now. I thought these small ledges would be cool for some badgers to be shooting down towards the player from, but they're so small that the badgers would be turning constantly. I decided to add the ability to make the badgers static. I did this by adding an isStatic property that is checked before the badger moves, as well as a property to determine which way they should face if they are static. It wasn't as simple as I thought, and it highlighted some of the problems I had with where the badgers are shooting from. I initially wasn't shooting from their origin point because they were shooting in a straight line and the bullet would go above the player, but this doesn't really work in our situation. With bullets now being aimed right at the player, I could remove the vertical offset and shoot from a bit higher, meaning the ledges were no longer getting in the way. I think it's time for some new enemies. Roaches seemed appropriate for this dingy little town. I wanted to get a bit more creative with their behaviour compared with the other enemies in the game so far, so I jotted down some notes on some basic actions that they will have, as well as a more detailed description on their states and how they will switch between those states. Let's start with a super simple sprite to play around with. I won't bother putting any effort into the art yet until I know that the mechanics are actually feasible to implement, and thus, this abomination was born. I created my new enemy object and inherited from my parent enemy class, which to be honest, I've kind of forgotten how it works altogether after the last batch of adding new enemies. Hopefully I've kept the parent class fairly flexible, but these little guys will be working quite a bit differently from the other enemies that I've added so far. He did not want to hang around.
Goodbye to the people who hated on me.
One issue I've been having a bit of trouble with throughout the development of the game is when I only want the enemy to detect the player on the Y-axis and not on both axes. I've fudged things around a few times by checking the Y positions of the player and the enemy to make sure they align, but always seem to have the issue of the enemy being unalerted when we jump over them, due to the player not being on their Y-axis anymore. But as far as I know, that's not a feature in Game Maker. It's definitely possible that there are functions that I'm just not aware of, so if that's the case, feel free to let me know in the comments. I figured a good way to work around it would be to calculate whether the player or the enemy is higher up, assuming the player is grounded to exclude when it's just a jump over the enemy, and to check for a floor collision between the lower entity's X and Y coordinate, but instead of checking against the X and Y coordinate of the higher entity, and often not having a floor collision, match the lower entity's Y coordinate with the higher entity's X coordinate. This way, we know we can safely set the enemy back to idle as the player has switched floors. I added in some code to detect who was higher and do some appropriate collision checks to determine whether we should switch back to idle. I'm realizing as I code this that the enemy is going to burrow and probably invalidate all of these collision checks, but that's a problem for later. For now, everything seems to be working as expected. I'll probably transfer some of this code over to the starfish enemies as well, as I've realised they're behaving a little bit silly in detecting the player before they even touch the floor. Let me know in the comments if you've got a smarter way to handle this. I'm sure there is, but for now it works. Let's get burrowing. And as suspected, I almost immediately realised I didn't need the code I just spent ages figuring out, but it will definitely come in handy for other enemies. I created states for burrowing, breaking through and stunned, and we had our basic roach working. A quick fix to the image X scale and we're golden. I shortened the breakthrough time and added a quick fix to stop the roach chasing us onto other platforms if we moved onto them, and everything was looking good. At this point, I'm confident that another issue will creep up that I just haven't played enough to find yet, but for now I'm happy with their mechanics and ready to start getting some art together. As always, let's start with a list of everything we'll need. I realised also that I want them to be quite a lot bigger than they were during the mechanics development, which may lead us into some collision box issues, but I'm sure it won't be too hard to fix if it does. I opened up Sprite and got to work. Any artists out there are probably going to be pretty horrified with my workflow and my design choices. I'm just a developer trying to get by here. Without being too self-deprecating, I am a really terrible artist. I always have been, and that's totally fine. I'm getting better day by day and that's the main thing. In future projects, I'll definitely be looking to team up with someone. I'm a big fan of pixel art, so if that's what you do, let's connect. We could even try a couple of game jams together for fun and see how things go. Eventually, I settled on this for a base sprite. Now, the even harder part, animating all of those legs. After about an hour, I had something passable working. I don't see me managing to make it much better than this, so let's go with it. Anyone else missing this guy yet? Same. I added some simple animations for burrowing and breaking through, as well as a particle effect to sit above the ground while the enemy is burrowed. Played a bit and all is looking decent. So, the only thing left to do for this level was to go and create the artwork for the crumbling and the moving platforms. With all of that, I gave the level a run through, and apart from missing some pretty backgrounds, felt like it was really decent. I'll likely make a few tweaks here and there, but all in all, I'm fairly happy that I now have all the necessary components for creating the rest of the zone. On the subject of artwork, I think something my game is really lacking is some nice parallax backgrounds to give it that proper polish and make it really feel like a game. I'm going to spend some time trying to pretty things up whilst designing the rest of this remaining zone. Hopefully by the next devlog, I'll have some of that stuff to show as well. If any of you budding artists out there wanted to potentially get involved, give me a shout via the email in my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked it, you know what to do. And you can check out my game's demo on Steam and give that a wishlist if you have a good time. See you in the next one. Cheers.